I shot myself in the face 6 years ago. Yeah, it's been kind of a wild ride rebuilding since, but I mean, it's taken my life in an incredibly different but powerful direction. And I do a lot of this stuff now, hoping that sharing the low times keeps someone else from going down that path.
Hey there, my name is Sean, and this is Suicide Noted. On this podcast, I talk with suicide attempt survivors and ideators so that we can hear their stories. Every year around the world, many millions of people try to take their own lives, and we almost never talk about it. We certainly don't talk about it enough, and when we do, when we engage, most of us are not very good at it. So one of my goals with this podcast is to have more conversations, and hopefully better conversations with survivors, in large part to help more people in more places hopefully feel a little less shitty and a little less alone. Now, if you are a suicide attempt survivor or ideator and you'd like to talk, please reach out. Our email is hello@suicidenoted.com, and I would love to speak with you. You can learn more about this podcast by checking out the show notes, the podcast description, our website, suicidenoted.com. And I will be including a link, it may not be this Monday, but very soon, in this same episode description and many other places, for our fundraising campaign for the upcoming tour, which I plan to start the very beginning of October, so it's rather soon. Would love your support if you can support us in that way. Finally, we are talking about suicide on this podcast. My guests and I don't hold back, so please take that into account before you listen or as you listen. But I do hope you listen because there's so much to learn. Today, I am talking with Zach. Zach lives in Colorado, and he is a suicide attempt survivor. Zach, what's up? You have a podcast?
I do. It's called Going In Blind with Zach Tidwell. It's not blindness related. It's just it was a play on words, obviously, because I'm blind.
But it's not about blindness.
Correct.
What's it about?
I'm following my curiosity, but it's like human stories of people that are out there kicking ass. I've spoken with anyone except for one. I had one episode where I spoke with a self-proclaimed prophet, and that one was off kilter, but I had a Navy SEAL on just recently. His episode won't air for like another 2 months, but he has 2 Bronze Stars with a Valor device for his actions in combat. I've had a former Super Bowl champ on who's had 9 emergency brain surgeries from all the head trauma he had playing football his entire life. Founder and executive director of nonprofits, and wow. It's a bunch of ass kickers out there.
Well, one day when I feel comfortable enough to call myself an ass kicker, I'm going to pitch you for me to be on there. But I'm a ways away, Bo. I'm a ways away.
Yeah, I'm learning that interviewing is a much different skill than being interviewed.
Hey, we learn.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. That's sort of my formal thanks to you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thanks.
Let's dive right in if we can. You tried to take your own life, yes?
I shot myself in the face 6 years ago. Yeah.
How old are you?
29. So March 31st was actually 6 years. So we just hit the anniversary, and yeah, it's been kind of a wild ride rebuilding since, but I mean, it's taken my life in an incredibly different but powerful direction. And I do a lot of this stuff now, hoping that sharing the low times keep someone else from going down that path.
Yeah. I'm going to jump right in with a question that some people say I'm not supposed to ask.
Okay.
And it's really big and it's really broad and it'll probably lead us in different directions. Why 6 years ago did you shoot yourself in the face?
Keeping it as simple as I can. I reached a place where I felt like the place that I was in was inescapable, and that was all a byproduct of me not speaking up because I thought that was weak and self-medicating with alcohol instead. And so it's the compounding factor of time and stuffing those things down mixed with fueling that with a depressant. And that is what caught up with me. It was about a year in total of that struggle. It all happened after a traumatic brain injury from a motorcycle accident. And that came at a time when I was going through some serious personal turmoil. And so it was horrible timing, but that is, in a nutshell, what compounded and led me to that point where I made that irrational decision.
Well, that's an interesting way to frame it. So At the time, did it feel irrational?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the thing though. I don't think this gets touched on a lot. I think that's the catch here is that when you reach that point, when you're considering suicide as an option, you're not in a sane state of mind anymore. And there's no way. And this is why I say that. If you think every living thing on earth, we exist here to procreate and to preserve our own lives. Killing yourself flies in the face of both of those things. I mean, that really, when it boils down to our instincts and any animal instincts, that is what you're doing. You're here to exist and continue existing and then pass along your genes. Committing suicide flies in the face of that. So I don't believe that you're in a sane state of mind by the time that you reach that point. And so, yes, I thought it was a rational decision, but that's in the context of I felt this place that I was in was inescapable. It was almost 2 years after I shot myself. It was the first time that I ever actually worked through a serious bout of depression. Basically, the pace of everything in me rebuilding my life had finally slowed down again. I was back out on my own and had essentially achieved all of the short-term goals that I had. You know, I when I woke up in the hospital after being taken off of life support, I had to relearn everything from feeding myself and brushing my teeth to standing up to walking. And 8.5 months later, I was snowboarding again. A month after that, I was back in college. And 6 months after that, I was back out on my own. And so there was this just such rapid pace of me chasing that independence and making those things happen that about 6 months after I finally moved back out on my own, right in the heart of the COVID lockdowns, I had finally achieved my goal of I had my independence back. I was in college, but I was living in downtown Denver where I didn't know anyone. Everything was locked down and it was winter break over college or for my college classes. And so I had nothing going on. It registered to me how different my life was and how hard everything was now and just how nothing was second nature anymore. Everything that I did, whether it was cooking or cleaning or whatever, writing a 2,000 word, a short paper for school, like everything was just painstaking. It dawned on me how much everything had changed and how, even though how much I had accomplished since shooting myself, how much work there still was to do. And for whatever reason, and this doesn't make sense, again, like by all measures, I had achieved my goals and was on this incredible path and had done so much in the way of rebuilding myself. But I reached a point it was like the winter, it was like late 2020 rolling into the first several months of 2021, where I reached a point where I did not want to be here again, but it was weird. I didn't want to be alive, but at the same time, I didn't want to be alive, but I didn't want to kill myself because I knew that wasn't the answer. I had learned from my mistakes. And so at that point, I had the same psychologist. Basically, after I was stabilized in the hospital, I was transferred from a private facility to the VA. And I've had the same psychologist since I was transferred to the VA through today. And at that point, we were talking once a week, just our little maintenance calls and still, working through everything that I hadn't dealt with leading up to my suicide attempt. But I still think this is probably the bravest thing that I've ever done. But I was terrified to speak up because I thought that someone was going to call the cops. They were going to show up, bust into my house and rip me out and put me in a psych ward and medicate me until someone else deemed that I was safe enough to be back out on my own. But I knew that if I didn't speak up, I was going to do something crazy. And so I told her, and we went from speaking once a week to every day and sometimes multiple times a day. And that lasted 4 months. But I got through it and I learned the skills to get through that and sit in that misery and come out on the other side of it and how to process it while I was in it and know that and learn that in the long term, like this sentiment of this too shall pass, so long as I show up and do the work. And that was the first time that I ever dealt with it. And that's carried me through to today. And that's why I say, I know that was a long tangent here, but that was a huge turning point in my life. And that is why I say I was in that irrational place where I believed that was inescapable. And that is such a crazy thing to say now, knowing that I've worked through that and so much worse, even since that time. That's all I needed to know was, okay, you can talk about this and open up, and it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be comfortable and it's not going to be fast, but you can get through it. And that's why I talk about this stuff now. Like, that's all it takes. You have to speak up. That is the first step in breaking out of this seemingly inescapable place that you feel trapped in, because it feels like that. It feels like you're trapped.
One of the questions, or two of the questions I often ask is, how many people know that we're talking and how many people know about your attempt or your attempts. And from what you shared, it sounds like probably more than a few for both of those questions. You're open about it.
Completely. And it wasn't like that early on. It's been intentional work for me. I used to, the personal circumstances that I hinted at a while, I was on my second deployment in the Marines and my wife was cheating on me. And I found out from the other guy's wife. And so I came back from that and was trying to deal with that. We finally separated, and then I was in that motorcycle accident a couple months after we separated. And I used to not even be able to talk about everything that happened with her. And then especially not after I shot myself, and especially not while I had lost all of my independence and was having other adults wipe my ass in the bathroom while I'm in the hospital because of my inaction to combat what I was dealing with, and through my own actions of pulling that trigger of ending up in that place. And so I couldn't talk about that for a long time, but that was a very intentional change that I made in my life pretty early on. It was actually on after that first snowboarding trip, I had met another blind veteran who was blinded in a hunting accident, and just the way that he shared his story. And I asked him, like, how do you talk about it like that? And he was like, you have to own it. Because at that point I was getting just horrible reactions to when I would open up, because it was never in a good, really open way. And it was like, I would avoid it until someone kind of pushed my buttons enough to where I'd be like, I shot myself in the face. So right now, this will be, when this comes out, I'll share this around. I've talked about this on, I don't know how many podcasts about this point. I've spoken about it publicly in speeches. Everyone knows about it now. It's part of my life. But, a lot of that took me building myself back up to some extent after the fact. That wasn't an immediate thing.
I don't know how far back we go. I'm always kind of curious. You're 29. Just a few sort of like questions that I'm curious about, whether it seems super related or not. Where did you grow up?
All over the place. My dad was in the military too. So I was born in Montana, moved to Mississippi, back to Montana, to New Jersey, Oklahoma, Virginia, Michigan, Florida for a very brief stint while my dad was reactivated after 9/11, and then Colorado.
Had you ever thought, beyond sort of a philosophical or existential idea of suicide that I think most people at some point think about, it enters their mind, had you, Zach, personally ever thought about suicide as even a remote option up until what we'll learn more about soon?
Like what you said, I do think, there's a difference. I think everyone has that. That's a normal thing for humans to consider, having a passing thought of it as opposed to ruminating on it and planning on it and doing it. Obviously, those are different things. But for me, I was very, very against it, because I have suicide on both sides of my family and murder-suicide on one side of my family. I mean, obviously, murder-suicide is deplorable, but that's never changed. That my take on that has never changed. But the people who committed suicide, I thought that they were cowards, having never experienced depression, right? And I don't use the term depression lightly. When I talk about my story, every once in a while, someone will be like, "Oh yeah, I've been having a rough couple days here. I'm dragging, trying to get myself going." And I'm like, that's not depression. These are different things. And I think the word gets devalued sometimes. And obviously, using it in a passing way is very different than being like, "Oh, I had 3 rough days here. I'm depressed." I don't think that's the same thing. So I didn't, because I looked down upon people who took that path. I just zero empathy for it.
I appreciate that. I don't think a lot of people, I think some people would be open to that. That's a hard one, I think, for some people to own up to, for lack of a better word.
It takes experience, it's life. Like it was a belief that I had through just a preconceived notion of what those people went through or what they did or didn't go through, and just not understanding it. And you really, everyone's going to handle that differently. Can't put yourself inside their heads.
And do you go into the military out of high school, college?
Yeah, I started talking to a recruiter when I was 16, or at least I tried to, and he was like, "Hey man, I can't talk to you until you're 17. Come back in a year." So
you were amped to go into the military.
Yeah, I wanted to be like my dad. He was Air Force, but I knew my whole life I wanted to go in the military. I didn't know if I was going to go to college first or enlist, but that was always in my path. I left for I was supposed to leave for boot camp, I think within a couple of weeks after I graduated, but I had gotten injured wrestling my senior year. So that got delayed a little bit, but it was still in 2 or 3 months after I graduated that I went to boot camp. I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years and served as a machine gunner. So I was stationed with Victor 3-5 out of Camp Pendleton, and I deployed twice, but both of my deployments were into the Pacific. So I didn't see combat The first
Hmm.
deployment was a unit. It's a UDP deployment, a unit deployment program deployment, and it's basically you go train in foreign climates. So it's 2 months in Okinawa, kind of bounce around in the jungle. 2 months on the main island in Japan, main island of Japan, training in the snow on Mount Fuji, and then another 2 months back in Okinawa. And then the second one was a 31st MEU, which is the Marine Expeditionary Unit. And so the Marine Corps is an amphibious force. We always traditionally have been. It's a kind of like overwhelming shock and awe. You hit the beach, you go in, you annihilate everything, and the army comes in and occupies afterwards and carries on sustaining operations. Obviously, the Marine Corps had to get away from that in the Middle East, but that is like the bread and butter of the Marine Corps historically. And so those Marine Expeditionary Unit deployments are constantly on rotation around the world in different areas of operation. So that one was in the Pacific. It was when Kim Jong-un was firing missiles over Japan. So we were kind of, you're always there in case something pops off, then you're the first ones to go in. And at the time, that was the threat that was kind of on the horizon or potential. And we wound up just training in Japan at sea and then in the Australian outback as well.
It sounds hard, but kind of cool.
Yeah, the work of being an infantryman is brutal and my body's beat up and it's rough. But I mean, what 18-year-old doesn't want to shoot machine guns and blow stuff up? And it sucks being away from home. It's hard work, but I also got to see Japan and Australia, and I didn't have to deal with and I struggled with this for a long time. I was actually very insecure about the fact that I haven't been to combat, especially in the infantry world. Like that is kind of the pinnacle, or at least culturally the pinnacle. But I can now look back and be thankful that I don't have to deal with the burdens of having had to experience war. I just, I lucked out there. You can't imagine what those guys have to deal with. And again, all of them are going to process it differently, but also they come out of a culture where, you don't talk about that stuff. And it is still on the individual to take action on that. But I think that is where a lot of people get themselves into trouble coming out of that, is thinking, like I did, that speaking up is weak.
Perhaps I digress here a little bit, but why do you think that is? And I think it is arguably more prevalent in certain spaces like the military. Might skew more towards men.
I think it definitely does skew more towards men.
In my experience, I've had 260 conversations. I'd say 75% are women. The men just don't reach out as much. Mm-hmm. That's one factor. And I'm wondering, because you've been around that world. I have not. Why do you think they don't talk?
I think like I said, men, I think already tend or trend towards that. I try and walk a fine line when I talk about this in the context of the military, because there is, especially in the infantry, you need hard people to do hard things. And so you need to be able to get the job done. You need to be able to shut up and suck it up in the moment. But I think for the combat vet guys, man, like those guys have to be able to come back and have a space. Okay, we're not hitting it right now. Let's process what we just went through for the past 9 months or 15 months that they were just deployed over there. And that's tough, because you need that space. But for me and for peacetime Marines or peacetime infantry guys, like it's, we're not going through that stuff. There's no room for bitches. And I mean that in the sense of being a quitter, which is very different than dealing with mental health. But I'm saying, like, there's a fine line where you have to be like, okay, we what's a real thing here and what's someone trying to get out of something. And I think that might be where some of that culture comes from, is we always heavily lean towards this guy's making shit up to get out of whatever this is. And so I think that's probably part of it. And again, there's just the kind of person that attracts, I think that field of work, that environment, whether it's cops or firefighters or the infantry or the military in general. Some of it might be pride. I mean, like looking back I'm just speaking for myself here. I think if you look back and me thinking that was weak, or even thinking that my own ancestors were cowards, I think there's some pride playing into that as well. It's hard work when you come back and something sucks and, you're just gone for 3 weeks getting slayed, and you come back or whatever, and it's like, all right, boys, we're gonna get together, we're gonna drink, like that sucked, we're gonna drink it in a way. And that, I think that can get out of control in that environment. But more so, I think when you get out, like for me personally, I think I thought that was a real coping skill, that and just lowering my head and just pushing through things and just brute forcing my way through things, because that served me well as a Marine. I felt I thought that would serve me in other capacities. And so I just kept applying that when like that's like a suppression skill, not a you're not actually coping with anything, you're just stuffing it down. I think that's another area of that where, you enter that environment when you're 18. You don't really have life experiences, but if that serves you well in that environment, then when you get out, like naturally you're going to think, well, that worked there, and this is a good thing. We learned through those experiences.
100%. Right. If it did absolutely no good, people would probably abandon it at some point. It would kind of just make no sense. So for sure it's doing some good, right? But like you're saying, it just doesn't work in all areas of life, presumably. It just doesn't.
Yeah, and obviously, if someone's listening to this, I'm not saying like, yeah, in some circumstances you should just drown whatever's making you, whatever's bothering you. That is not what I'm saying.
You're in the military for several years. If I'm doing my math right, it was 23 when you attempted?
I just turned 23.
Where do you go from you're joining the military at a pretty young age, post-wrestling career? You go in, you do your stuff. So what happens next?
So after I first got, I hit my unit, started dating a girl that I dated in high school again. We stayed together all the way through my first deployment.
Mm-hmm.
Things seemed to work. So moved out to California. We got an apartment together. Things worked. So I proposed to her. And then we knew I was going to deploy again. But basically, it was, all right, I've already proposed. We're going to get married at some point. Might as well get married before I deploy. We'll do like a courthouse wedding so that you can get the school benefits and the health benefits and stuff while I'm gone. I'll be making extra money in preparation for getting out. All that good stuff. So I deploy again in early 2017, tail end of that deployment when we're doing unit turnover. So we're back. We're not on ship anymore. We're back in barracks in Okinawa, and I needed surgery. I basically had a hernia that I needed to have an operation on. So I wasn't going to the field anymore. And we only had like a month or so left in the deployment. Another unit's coming over to take all of her gear over and all that stuff. I woke up one morning to go outside for formation, had a Facebook Messenger message from a woman who I didn't recognize the name. She basically dropped the news. She's like, hey, I don't know what kind of relationship you have with your wife, so I don't know if you're cool with this, but just so you know, this is what she's been talking to my husband about, and sent me some screenshots of some conversations that they were having about hooking up. Rocked my world, obviously. But like I said, when I came back, I think I came back in November of 2017. I was trying to make it work with her, and just there was no trust. So it didn't. And I finally separated from her in January of 2018. So a couple months after we got back. And wasn't in a great spot, but I was dealing with it. And I was just, again, kind of in that vein of just lowering my head and just pushing through things. I was just keeping myself super, super busy. So I became a gym rat for sure. I started training for a half marathon and raced in a half marathon, which I had never done before. And then on the weekends, taking my dirt bike out to the racetrack. I'd gotten into motorcycles after getting into the Marines. I'd had a crotch rocket, and I had this dirt bike, and I was taking it to the racetrack on the weekends. And one of the weekends in March of 2018 that I took it out there, I was in a really nasty wreck, and I still don't know what happened. I have some of the pieces of the story that have been told to me by other people, but I don't remember that entire day. I have like a vague memory of picking my bike up on the backside of a jump. But long story short, I had a traumatic brain injury from that, and I spiraled after that. That is when things went downhill. And I don't know how, like, this wasn't apparent to me at the time, because looking back now, I mean, these are all just stereotypical side effects of a traumatic brain injury. But I became very agitated and impulsive and couldn't sleep, really started to ruminate on everything that had just happened with my soon-to-be ex-wife. I'd filed for divorce, but hadn't been finalized yet. Couldn't sleep. So I started finding that a couple drinks before bed would let me kind of help me turn my mind off so I could fall asleep. And I still couldn't really stay asleep, but I was getting, it wasn't taking me 3 hours to fall asleep. That continued through, I was honorably discharged in August of that year, came home and immediately started going to school to become an ER nurse, and just kept keeping my head down, trudging along, going to school full time, working full time, hitting the gym. Those are really like the only big three things that I was doing very consistently. That and drinking eventually turned into just about every night, getting into a worse and worse place and not talking about it to the point where it's like I mentioned that impulsiveness was coming out. I've always been very, very safe with my money and always been a big saver. I got out of the Marines and I spent $5,000 to have my truck lifted and get new rims and tires. I went and bought a decked out Glock for my concealed carry. Bought a $3,500 downhill mountain bike and started downhill mountain biking. Like, I don't know. I think probably in addition to the alcohol, I was trying to fill a void there. And again, that impulsiveness is pretty common with big head injuries like that. But and I was just slowly withdrawing more and more. Ended up there were some issues with me and my family, my family being my parents, and I was just becoming increasingly apathetic. But the only thing, again, I was getting up super early to work out. I was going to work. I was going to school, getting good grades and all that, and then drinking at night, mostly like typically to blackout. And this whole time I was keeping up appearances to the point that winter of 2018 into early 2019, like I would drive a couple hours up to the mountains to go snowboarding. That was my favorite thing to do in high school. And that is a huge part of the reason that I moved back to Colorado. I didn't really have like a home state, but I moved back here for the mountains because I was addicted to snowboarding. I was just trying to force myself to get out of the house. I would drive a couple hours up to the mountains, get to the ski resort, be like, man, I still don't want to be here. And so instead of just going home, I would sit in my truck for a couple hours before driving home so that it looked like I went snowboarding. That spring, I did the same thing with my dirt bike. I would load all my gear up, drive to a racetrack, pay to get in and get there and be like, gosh, dude, I don't want to be here. And I'd sit there for a couple hours so that it looked like I went and rode my dirt bike and like nothing was wrong. And that carried through to March of 2019. So a year after the accident. I don't know what changed this day. I was totally sober, stone cold sober. And for some reason, on March 27th, I had an idea for my way out. Again, I had reached this point where I felt like this misery and this apathy that I was feeling where I just couldn't find joy in anything and was miserable constantly. I was pissed off. Any interactions with people were pissing me off. Like just everything, nothing. I was just being negative and nothing was going well. I couldn't sleep. And I'm adding the massive dose of a depressant to my body every night. And so I'm waking up hungover. I'm sure that's not helping. This is the first time in my life and only time in my life that I guess this and the night that I shot myself, the only time that I've ever mishandled a firearm. I retrieved my concealed carry from my desk in my room and cleared it out and held it to my head in different places. And it is ridiculous to say, but I felt like a weight was lifted. It was like, I do have a way out and I found my way out. The fact that you can do that and not have alarm bells going off in your head and instead feel at peace, I think, again, speaks to the fact that you're not in a sane state of mind. But I didn't do it that night. No, I wasn't even intending to do it that night. Again, it was completely cleared out. There was no magazine inserted. There was no round in the chamber, nothing. I just held it and I needed to feel it. And I knew. That's March 27th. March 30th, my parents came over to my house and visited with my two younger sisters. And they were in my room, in that same room. And I didn't say anything. They said I seemed grumpy and tired, but that wasn't abnormal for me at the time. I've already kind of hinted at I was kind of a grumpy person at this point, and also working and going to school full time is a lot. So they didn't think that was a red flag or anything. And the next day, for whatever reason, I do wonder, because when I was sober on the 27th, I didn't act on it, even though that wasn't my intent that night to act on it. On March 31st, I decided that I was going to kill myself, and I started recording a video to my parents. I had a couple drinks, get some liquid courage because I knew what I was about to do. And I recorded this video. I thought it was more personal than a note. And I've only realized since in writing my book that and talking about it, that was the first time that I'd ever opened up about any of this stuff. I was finally explaining myself to my freaking iPhone camera and just trying to make sure that my mom, my dad, and my two sisters had all been addressed, and that I had explained to each one of them why I was doing what I was about to do.
You still have that video?
I don't. Somebody might.
You've never listened to it or watched it since that?
I don't think it would do me any good. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So you leave the video, okay, or some part of it.
Yeah. So I had a 2-bedroom apartment with a buddy that I'd gone to high school with. He wasn't home when I started recording the video. I'm sure, the video went longer than I expected because I'm bawling, talking to my phone, finally expressing all of this stuff. So it's just kind of pouring out of me, and I'm getting drunk. And he came home early from work, and so I paused the video. And if I remember correctly, I don't think I ever actually addressed my youngest sister, because I remember my mom asked me about that at some point, like, how come you never talk, or how come you never addressed Macy? And so I don't remember any of this, but I guess he got home early from work. I paused the video and just went out there and talked to him like nothing was wrong. I'm guessing I probably, went in the bathroom and splashed some water on my face or something, so you couldn't see that I was crying. I went out into the kitchen because it was set up so it was like my room and bathroom on one side, his room and bathroom on the other side, and then the living area and kitchen in the middle. Went out to the kitchen, talked to him, just like nothing was wrong, seeing how his day was, what he was going to be doing. Like, hey man, I'm done with all my homework. You gonna hop on Xbox later? And he's like, yeah, I'll be on after I finish my dishes and all that, eating dinner and doing my dishes. Yes, I went back to my room. He went back to his, and a couple minutes later, he heard the gunshot.
And you know how to use a gun?
Yes, that's what I did for 4 years professionally. But yeah, I shot myself in between the eyes, which is where we are trained to shoot for headshots, because it's supposed to drill back to a specific part of your brain called the medulla oblongata, which regulates your autonomous functions and is basically an off button.
Right, but not with you. It didn't work.
I guess I'm a horrible shot, but
that might have been the one time to be a bad shot, right?
Yeah, I think it was my ammunition choice. So it was my concealed carry firearm, and for some reason I didn't think I had hollow points in there. I always carried hollow points in that pistol, and then I didn't think to exchange that for a ball round. So I don't know if you're familiar with the structure of your sinuses, but there's actually a pretty large bone structure that sits back behind that area, kind of like behind the bridge of your nose and like that in between your eyes. There's a bunch of cavities there. And so there's a lot of bone. And I think when the round hit all of that bone, not to mention the part of my forehead and like bridge of my nose that it punched through, it just broke up. And so none of the bullet actually entered my brain. So if you can see here, the bridge of my nose on both sides, the lower part of my forehead, and this entire right eye socket and my sinuses are all rebuilt with titanium. So all that was gone. And so a lot of the bone shrapnel and the bullet shrapnel left my face. Got some pieces inside of my head still, but it all rode around the inside of my skull. And I think that's what saved me, was, again, the fact that it was a hollow point. So it is intended to break up instead of mushroom into a slug and just punch through.
What's it like to have a gun pointed in between your eyes? Is it a quick boom, done, out, and boom? Or do you wait 10 seconds? Are you crying? Do you remember?
So I guess I want to turn this on you a little. I'm curious, where's that? Because I'm sure there's other people that are curious about this. Like, where's that almost like morbid curiosity? Is it just morbid curiosity? Or
I think there's a lot of people. Well, I'm going by conversations I've had. It doesn't account for most human beings, of course.
Yeah.
Who are suicidal, who have attempted, feel desperately alone in that experience, which includes the moment of. Perhaps a little morbid. That's fair. I always want to slow down the day of and sometimes the moment of, just to get a sense of that. So people out there might be like, I felt kind of that way too.
So I don't remember that day. I don't even remember recording that video. I don't remember talking to my roommate. I woke up while he was on the phone with 911, and I don't remember any of that. But I feel like I've already done a good job communicating this. I'm not glorifying this. That on the 27th, dude, I felt at peace. It seriously, it was, I've had this heavy, just crushing cold of the depression just looming. And then all of a sudden, this is like, all right, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. I knew that night that I wasn't going to kill myself again. That wasn't my intent. I just, for whatever reason, decided that was now an option to me and held it to my head. And I remember I'd always looked at firearms as a tool. And that night, it was like, it wasn't just a tool. It was salvation. And I remember like it was like I hadn't handled this or carried this gun with me every day. It was like I'd turned it over in my hand and felt the weight, and it feels different when it's not loaded, even though I've spent who knows how many hours handling this thing when it's not loaded. And it was just this weird the insanity of that, where like you're like, okay, this thing kind of takes on a different light. It is so ridiculous. But that is what I remember. I don't remember actually pulling the trigger or any of that. And even I don't know how much of that is me being drunk. I think a lot of that is the brain trauma. Again, I still don't. There's a whole kind of wild story after that motorcycle accident. I don't remember any of that. These head
Mhm.
injuries like that are insane. And then to add to that, so I shoot myself. I'm drunk. I don't remember waking up while he was on the phone with 911. I guess I was just asking for help and water. And then I was even combative with the EMTs and the paramedics on the way to the hospital. But they put me on life support when I got there. So then I'm on who knows what cocktail of meds for however long. And I just think, again, compounding factors there where my memory is gone for quite some time there.
How long are you in the hospital for?
It was 51 days total. So they didn't know if I was going to survive. Once they knew I was going to survive, they didn't know if I was going to be a vegetable. Once they knew I wasn't going to be a vegetable, they didn't know if I was still going to be in there and still be me. But, things just kept getting better and better. And then I finally, when I came to, I guess I flipped off my dad. We have that sense of humor where we mess with each other a lot. And they said something and I flipped them off. And then they knew I was going to be okay.
Right.
And
Zach's back.
yeah, they were like, he's still in there. I could have a conversation like we are right now early on, but I was seeing such vivid hallucinations of places, even though I couldn't see a person, they didn't get the point across to me that I was blind. I was that messed up. None of it made sense. And so I'm trying to interact with things that aren't there. And eventually they said that, or had thought that I was going to get some sight back in my left eye when I had my facial reconstruction. Eventually dropped it on my lap that I was going to be totally blind, but I made the decision that day that I wasn't just going to become a bump on a log because I'd done this to myself and acquired I'm totally blinded, deaf, in 1 year now. I'm still going to do something purposeful with my life. And it was also, so I had my facial reconstruction about 40-ish days into that hospital stay. They kept the bullet hole open that entire time and were packing it with gauze twice a day. And I had, after my surgery, I think it was that first night, my whole body, they still don't know what happened. We never got real answers on what happened. We don't know if it was my body just going into shock. We don't know if it was my body responding to an infection. They wound up doing a spinal tap and taking all sorts of samples and stuff. But that night, I was just on the post-med floor and my dad was with me. We were talking and then my whole body just started seizing up and then I started shaking and I was alert this whole time. My whole body, just these horrible convulsions of my whole body locking up. And I thought I was going to die. But in my mind, as that was happening, I didn't want that to happen. Even though here I was, I had just had my whole face pieced back together. My dad ran out of the room and was screaming for people to help. And I start crying as I'm not in control of my body. And he's like, "You're a fucking fighter. Don't you fucking give up on me." And he's just hovering over my head. And it was just this powerful moment where it's just 40 days earlier, I had pulled a trigger. And now, there had been a lot of work. There was a lot of therapy. There was a long road ahead of me, but I'd been starting to talk about this stuff. It was out in the air. And even in that short of a time, I was able to that, just nothing, okay, I do want to be here. I had felt that way while I was in the hospital that whole time, but it was that night, there was no question.
So I'm wondering whether it's the attempt, your hospital stay, or this realization. How did people respond to you?
I had overwhelming support from my family, whether it was my parents or even my mom's closest friends. And I had aunts fly out from across the country to come and cousins fly across the country. And I had someone at the hospital with me every day. But with that said, my parents definitely struggled with it. I think, I don't remember exactly how I worded it, but I had mentioned that there were some tensions with me and my family there as I was kind of getting into a darker and darker place. And when I had first come back to Colorado, my parents had offered, "Hey, if you're working and going to school, you can stay with us rent free." And so, of course, I'd take them up on that offer. My divorce isn't even finalized yet. I'm kind of getting my stuff together and figuring out this new chapter of my life, both in terms of profession and being single again and just kind of getting back on my feet. So I did, but they wound up kicking me out of the house. And that was a month or two. I think it was about a month before I shot myself. And that's absolutely not their fault that I wound up shooting myself in the face. All of that is on me, and me reaching that point is on me. Me not taking the steps to speak up or address that, that's all on me. But internally, they struggled with that, and they also struggled with the fact that they had been at my house the day beforehand. that's a natural thing for people who get left behind. I was fortunate enough to survive, and they eventually started to do better as I started to do better. And especially, I was getting after it, man. I was chasing rebuilding my life. And like, there was no question that I was going to do that, but they started to do better as I did that until some serious struggles came later on. That wasn't until a couple of years later, but I know they struggled with that misplaced guilt. I try and talk about that too, so that people who do get left behind in these unfortunate events, like, it's a natural feeling to have. But at the end of the day, just like with me, agency is still on the person who pulled the trigger, who did whatever, who took the pills, whatever. Like, it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about. And obviously we want to talk about our loved ones in the best light possible. And I'm not diminishing anyone or tarnishing anyone's legacy there. But at the end of the day, as you work through your grief, you do have to realize that that is not on you.
Hard though.
Yes. And hard to say too, but I feel comfortable saying that, having been through it. And I think it like anything, it's easier said than done. And again, natural to feel that. And but also I think people need to hear that so that they can reach a place where, maybe even if it's years down the road where you're like, okay, like this, obviously it's not going to remove the pain, but just realize that, okay, that's not, lift some of that burden off of you.
Yeah. You were in that hospital for, you said 51 days?
Yeah. And that was split between the private facility and the VA hospital.
Mental health care?
No, not. It was, well, I mean, I had a babysitter basically I think it was the entire time I was there, but I had a bullet hole in my forehead. I couldn't even sit up in bed for the first couple of weeks. Like, I wasn't going anywhere.
Because you had shared earlier that after this happens, it was 2 years later that you sunk into a different kind of depression, perhaps, or another depression. Is that right?
Yeah, and I go kind of back and forth on this. I feel like it might be the worst depression I've ever been through because I was sober through all of it. I shot myself on March 31st of 2019, and this happened late, like the very end of 2020 into the first couple months of 2021.
So in some ways, by no means want to put words in your mouth, it sounded like in some ways you're doing better, at least on paper, once you get out of the hospital.
Yeah.
On paper is, I guess, the big important word there, right? You touched on a little bit earlier, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about once you're out and you start rebuilding your life, how as best you know, how do you get to that place in the end of 2020, beginning of 2021?
Yeah. People think that this is another thing. I try and be very intentional about talking about. Like, if you look at where I'm at today with all the things I've done, I've written this book, I taught myself how to code and now create software that everyone can use, whether they have a disability or not, and like do all these things and compete in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and ski and rock climb and whitewater kayak and whatever else. And like, people see, if you see, okay, he shoots himself in the face at that, you're like, wow, that was a cool, feel good comeback story. But like you said, I do think the reality is just not. The reality is a lot messier there. Like, I eventually dealt with 2.5 years of rampant alcoholism, or along with some other huge things. But I had been back out on my own for over, I guess, 6 months, and rolling into 21, that would have been over 6 months. But it was the pace of everything. Like, up until that point, it was just, I'm chasing thing after thing. I'm going on it was that first snowboarding trip 8.5 months after I was doing that, and all sorts of these other trips where I'm going out and doing these new things. Back in college, it was like all these new things, new experiences with these adaptive sports. I'm back in college, I'm back out on my own. And then it was, like I said, it was winter break. So there's no college all of a sudden. I had just bought my first house. So I was alone in this new house and like fully back out on my own, as opposed to living in the dorms without, with kind of like training wheels that I had first gotten out on my own. I don't know anyone in Denver, and it's the middle of the COVID lockdowns. I had just started training Brazilian jiu-jitsu like that I think in like the middle of January in 2021, but the pace of everything had slowed down. And like I said, I realized, oh my God, like how agonizing it was to get anything done, how long it took me to do everything, and how clear it was, despite the fact that I was out on my own. And, I was essentially faking it until I made it, like doing the fake it till you make it thing, and how long of a road I still had ahead of me. And it hit me, man, for whatever reason. And again, it didn't make sense, because on paper I had accomplished all these things and was doing incredibly well and adapting to my new circumstances. Apparently under the surface, that's where I was really at, because it felt like it came out of nowhere.
That must be brutal, though.
Yeah, it was this juxtaposition of like, And again, where to the outside looking in, it looks like I am killing it. And I
Yeah.
was on paper, I was killing it. It hit me. And, again, I spoke up and it took months to dig out of that pit, but I did it. It was like this seminal event where I realized, okay, there's a way out of these things. And I now know I've seen it. I've done it. There is a way out of this and it can and will get better if I do the work. That carried through all the way to, I was in a good place for a couple months there that summer. So the summer semester of 2021, my college stopped making my school materials accessible to me. Again, fully independent at this point. And then all of a sudden I'm beholden to having someone do everything for me again. Like they assigned someone to be my eyeballs instead of converting my materials like they were supposed to. So I literally had to have a sighted student basically hold my hand through my statistics homework, and it pissed me off just because I had worked so hard to get my independence back and wound up picking up the bottle again, not realizing, I don't know how, I hadn't realized that I was a functional alcoholic by the time that I shot myself. I only have realized this looking back. Like, to me, an alcoholic was the dude passed out on the bus in a puddle of his own piss, and can't hold a job. And it wasn't, again, on paper, I was killing it before I shot myself. I mean, the cognitive dissonance there is insane, but that kicked off 2.5 years of rampant alcoholism. That is, again, it was way worse than it ever was when I could see, but so I'd gotten back. I couldn't be a nurse. So I had started going to college for clinical psychology to try and turn this into something that could help someone else. And I started researching, like, okay, how come I'm able to pay my mortgage but not pay my HOA dues? Or how come I could do all of these higher level English classes fine with my screen reading software, but not my math homework? And I found out that it came down to the software running behind the scenes of each app or website that I was accessing. It depended on the code of each individual element on the screen. And like the vast majority of software is inaccessible. So I dropped out and decided to become part of the solution. Started to teach myself how to code as I fell into alcoholism worse than ever, because before it had been at night, I was getting hammered. This, over the course of time, at its very worst, I was binging for 2 or 3 days straight, blacked out the whole time, recovering for 2 or 3 days, because that's how long I would be hungover. So I'd be hungover for like 2 days, get 1 day sober where I felt good again, and then like do it all over again. And I couldn't string together more than a couple days of sobriety. But along that path, I tried AA, I tried an outpatient rehab program, I tried an inpatient rehab program. And while I was at the inpatient rehab program, got diagnosed with Huntington's disease. And it was just, then I had another excuse to drink when I came home. And it finally, things came full circle for me about 2 years after I started teaching myself how to code, because my first piece of software came out and it looked and functioned normally for people without disabilities. So like, you never would have known there was anything special about it. But whether you were colorblind, legally blind, totally blind and deaf, totally blind and deaf people can use my software with Braille. If you have no arms or you're paralyzed from the neck down, you can use it with your voice. Like, it was accessible to everyone. I started getting this insane feedback from people, and these people reaching out and thanking me for what I was doing. And I had finally found my purpose and reestablished some sense of identity again. And I made it like a month sober and then fell off the wagon. Then made it 2.5 months sober and fell off the wagon one more night. And I haven't had a drink since December 5th of 2023. And it's just, everything has continued to, the momentum of that progress has just continued to push forward through today. And it's not like it's been pretty. I basically drank away my ability to cope with stress. So I have had to rebuild that, and I've had to come to terms with, after having stopped drinking, I've had to come to terms with the Huntington's disease, because that will, if there's no medical advances, that will eventually turn me into a vegetable before something else kills me, like pneumonia or some secondary cause. And like, that's not a fun thing to think about, but like, it's, again, applying all these I've learned all of these coping skills over time, and it's another thing that you learn how to deal with, and life has carried forward. And now I've got the book that I'm about to start the 3rd draft on and then try and get published, and the public speaking engagements, and another piece of, like, another software solution that I'm hoping will turn into a real startup. Just sharing these stories so that people hear, like, it's not like life got any easier for me when I woke up with a bullet hole in my forehead and was completely blind and deaf in one ear. And it wasn't a completely uphill trajectory here. Things kept getting worse through my own actions. Of course, I can't do anything about the Huntington's disease. That's genetic, and I inherited that. But there's always a way forward through these things, and people need to hear that. So if you're that person that's nearing that insane state of mind, you do hear there's a way forward, and all you have to do is speak up so that someone knows that you need help.
Zach, as you've shared all this, especially the software part. Am I talking to like a famous gazillionaire?
I really believe that this current solution that I'm working on is going to turn into a true startup, but
And obviously much more
we'll
important
see.
than being famous or a gazillionaire is like, it sounds like it's helping people.
That's the big thing. And again, this will be that first app that I came out with was just a word puzzle game. And it was basically, it was a proof of concept for me because I taught myself how to code over those 2 years from reading articles online. I'd never written a single line of code in my life. And I could see, I made sure I could do handle the entire software development process, including all of the visual elements by myself and handle all of those accessibility implementations that I already touched on. That came out and won a couple awards. And that was my proof of concept that I can do this. And so now I've been taking those same strategies and applying them to actual these cutting edge technological solutions that I'm hoping it will be able to be leveraged by everyone, but it will be just an incredible force multiplier for people with disabilities in whatever capacity that disability is.
One of the things that has sort of organically come up in these conversations I've had with people is I ask them what their memoir title is, with the expectation that no one's ever writing the book. It's just a memoir title. I have a lot of fun with that. I mean, maybe one day publish a book of just titles.
Yeah.
But you actually have a book.
Yes.
Do you have a title? I just love titles.
Yeah. Again, I'm still on the revision path here. It'll be draft 3 and then on the road to publishing. So it'll be a while, but the working title is Raw Dog, A Blind Marine's Journey to Death's Door and Back.
And then you have a podcast called Going In Blind.
Yep. Going In Blind with Zach Tidwell.
With Zach Tidwell. And do you sleep or do you just, are you on go 24/7, man?
I'm pretty busy. I wake up in the morning. I code for a couple hours. Like I was up a little before 4 this morning. So I coded from 4 to 8:30 ish. I got on a call, then I got in the cold plunge. Then I went to jujitsu, then came back, coded for a little bit, got a workout in this afternoon, and then hopped on here. I believe in what I'm doing, man. It lights a fire under me, and this is something that I'm very passionate about. And so if I am not working out or out of town, this is what I'm doing.
Nice. Okay, the pink and purple pill question. I give you a pill. If you take it, you go to sleep, you pass away. There is no pain and nobody knows it's a suicide. I have an idea what you're going to do, but I want to ask anyway. What would you do with that pill?
I'm chucking it. I'm in a much better place with the Huntington's disease thing. And I struggle with the horizon of that, but I'm very hopeful, in the next 20 years here that there's going to be some pretty serious advancements in actually developing a cure for that. And so that's why I feel like I can chuck that. But a year ago, I don't think that would have been my answer. And I still, there's days here where I'm like, you know what? Medically assisted suicide is out there. And I think about that for the end before I am at a vegetative state. But there's days where I'm like, you know what? No, fuck that. I'm still growing, still working through some of this stuff.
There is medically assisted suicide, but right, only if you're terminal.
Yes, some people talk about that for mental health, and I think that is fucking insane. That is not an answer. That is not an answer. Yeah.
You would get some pushback for some people on that. You're right.
Yeah, that is very, very different. This is a treatable thing, and feel very strongly about that considering all the things that I've been through.
Yeah. But Huntington's is not treatable yet. So how did that come about? When did you learn about that?
When I was born, my grandfather was basically a vegetable, and it's passed down generation to generation. It's a 50-50 shot. So my mom has it. When we found out she had it, I got tested, which was right before I went to rehab, I got those results while I was at rehab. Pretty gnarly. But again, I'm very, very hopeful just with the way technology is heading. I think it's not going to have to be something that I have to deal with. And you know what? If I do, I kind of feel like I can handle anything at this point. And it is what it is. Like everyone's got their shit.
Everyone's got their shit. Did you ever get a diagnosis, mental health related? Because I know it sounds like you've been seeing somebody for a while and it's been helping.
Yeah. I have major depressive disorder and insomnia.
Insomnia is not something people talk enough about, I don't think, because that will kill you. That will kill people.
Yeah, your lymphatic system flushes your system while you're sleeping. And so that's where that really starts to become an issue outside of all the things that we don't understand necessarily what sleep does, but that's when your body flushes bad things out of you. So it's not good, but it's very common in people who are totally blind. It is your circadian rhythm is regulated through your retinas, and my retinas aren't attached to anything. So there's no signals going there. And so I wind up in these wild cycles where I mean, it feels like I'm hungover when I'm that sleep deprived. And it's nice that it's not from alcohol, but but again, it's just, I struggled with that for the first couple of years. And now I just learned to live in the suck a little bit.
You nailed it. It's like not just sleepy. I've had that in my history. I know what sleepy is. This is sick. It feels like you're sick.
Yeah, I had 3 days in a row here where I was up before midnight.
Oh, wow.
So I finally, last night and the night before, I got normal sleep. But, I typically go to bed about 9:30 and just up before midnight for the entire next day. I'm exhausted, but cannot go back to sleep. It is so weird.
Are there any myths or misconceptions? And some have sort of come up as we've talked, but perhaps ones that have not come up. And that can be around suicide or ideating, but any number of things we've just said that you just want to call bullshit on.
Yeah, I think we've already touched on some of them, but one that I do try and talk about and be very intentional in talking about, again, this is a potentially, not even potentially, somewhat unpopular opinion, but I feel comfortable talking about it again because of my lived experience. I think our society is missing the boat on these supposed warning signs that we talk about, and specifically for the fact that, yes, there is, I think there's two big segments of the population when you stop and look at suicides and specifically suicide attempts. Even there is the population who fits into that box of these very overt warning signs that we talk about. Okay, Joey's making these very obscure comments about how the world would be better off without him. Joey's making Facebook posts that are very obscure and almost attention seeking, that are morbid, and he's making these comments, and Joey's cutting himself or doing whatever X and Y and Z things, that Joey's starting to give his things away and starting to say goodbyes to people. That very clearly, and just if you're objective about this and stop and look at it without applying any emotional response to this, all of those things are cries for help. And when I say this, I'm not saying that those people need the exact same amount of help as someone who fits into the other category here. So know that before I move forward. But I think there's a huge difference between someone who thinks that they want to die and someone who wants to die. And I think the person who wants to die presents very differently. And I think that presents in the way that I did, where I hid it up until the very minute before I pulled the trigger. And I think that is why, on one side, we do have these warning signs that everyone knows of and are they get circulated. But then there's that other side where people are absolutely blindsided sometimes when people kill themselves. And I think it is because those people are hiding it.
Right.
And I didn't want someone to stop me. If the more overt signs are there, obviously you need to intervene. Again, that is a crisis just the same as the person who's hiding it. I'm not diminishing that. I'm just saying that they present differently. And that's easier to address, in my opinion, because that person is, even though that person may not realize that they are seeking, they're looking for help. They're trying to have someone stop them. So with that, these subversive kind of, when you're hiding it, the only real thing, and again, it's kind of a Hail Mary, but if you really know someone, if you know someone well and you notice these big baseline shifts, like I've said that there was in my behavior, and I am not saying someone should have noticed this. I had all of the agency in my situation. All of the blame is on me. But if Joey is normally this very outgoing person and doesn't normally drink a lot and is now becoming an asshole who's starting to pull away from people and is drinking most nights and is becoming very impulsive and making these purchases that are very out of character, that conversation needs to be had. And it needs to be more than, hey, how are you doing? It needs to be, hey, Joey, I'm noticing X, Y, and Z things that are very different about you, and it has me worried. I know you're going through this and that. Are you struggling with that? And if not, what's going on with this huge shift in behavior? It needs to be very direct. That opens the door there. And again, it's still on that person to speak up, but with it out in the air like that, that's a lot harder to brush off.
If I had asked you, not me necessarily, but let's say somebody close to you in your life, would you have spoken up? If they engage with you the exact same way you are asking others to engage when you were in the thick of it, would you have said anything?
Honestly, I don't know that I would have. And so that's why I say it's still on that person. But I truly believe that if I had heard someone with this same story as me now, if I'd heard this podcast episode while I was in that place, I think that's what would have had an impact. I think that would have snapped me out of it because, that speaking up is still very, very hard. That is very uncomfortable and it's painful. And being vulnerable like that is very hard. And at least if you hear something like this, even if you weren't in the military or you didn't have a TBI or whatever, you can still draw parallels here in the shifts and following the trajectory of where I went. And when you see, okay, you're like, okay, I've been pulling away from things. I'm having to pull teeth to go do things. And I'm starting to hide all of these markers that I'm not doing so hot. I think it's that is the other side of that, where like it's kind of hard to ignore that if you're that person and you're listening to this podcast right now. I mean, that's kind of the last step there, and hopefully snapping someone out of that. And again, at the end of the day, it's on that person. That is the unfortunate reality of this and any other human-centric problem. Like, people are going to do what they're going to do, but that's the best thing we can do to combat that is set the stage for these shifts and these openings to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, for sure. I can only add or hope that when that stage is set, that people who want to help can hold that space, which can be hard. Awkward transition, Zach, to your book. Is there a way people can learn more?
I have a mailing list on my website there's no spam. I've had the list for over a year and have not sent out a single email yet. It is just for the couple hundred people who have signed up on there and want news when the book is coming out. So if you want to be kept up to date with that, that's the big one. ZachTidwell.net.
I wanted to ask one last thing. And what's your connection to Wounded Warriors?
I got connected with them super early on. Enrolled in Wounded Warrior in that first year, and then definitely did my first event with them in 2020. And it was an adaptive sports event. I've done several with them since. Skiing was the first one, but skiing, rock climbing, whitewater kayaking. I compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu against people without disabilities. Like, I'm competing in another tournament on the 20th, and it'll be no one that I compete against is going to have any disabilities. But like with Wounded Warrior, that very first adaptive program that I went and did, it was my first time at an event where it wasn't just blind dudes. Again, this was super, super early on, and it was cool. It was a mixed event, and it's what's neat with Wounded Warrior, outside of the fact that there's these huge opportunities, is also it's not just you go and do the thing. You're not just going and rock climbing. So like, this was a multiple day event. Did rock climbing one day, hockey another day. So I got out and was ripping around on the ice skates, and it was cool because I had like a hockey stick as my cane. And then I think the last day we went and did a blacksmithing event. So like, I completely blind, they had me working on a forge, and I made a knife out of an old railroad tie. But with all of that stuff, very community centric, and there's always programming around the fun stuff. So it's okay. We had a part of our mental health team come in and run a workshop, and you're not boozing at these events either. So like, I think that's a very critical component. Veterans, service members like to get after it a little bit, but that's not, this is supposed to be a healing environment. And so they facilitate a more complete picture with these things, more than just, yes, that experience of having, like for me, getting back on the slopes was huge because, like I said, that was one of my favorite things to do. Yes, that plays a huge role in getting people to open up and also giving people some hope and serving as a lifeline. But they're also trying to get you some dietary information so that you can start to get yourself back on track if you're out of shape as an athlete, and start to behave like an athlete if you weren't an athlete, and actually treat your body like an athlete. And all right, we're doing a sleep workshop and a breathing workshop, and then now you're hooked into, we've got another team that we want to connect you with leaving here, so that now, we've kind of got constant contact and all of these community events that are not even adaptive sports related, that are always there as people need them, even in between these huge events, because obviously they've got a lot of people to take care of. So
you are the man, Dak. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. Hope the rest of your day is pretty decent. Ciao. Bye.
Bye.
As always, thanks so much for listening and all of your support. Special thanks to Zach in Colorado. Thank you, Zach. If you are a suicide attempt survivor or ideator and you'd like to talk, I would love to talk with you. Please reach out. hello@suicidenoted.com. If you would like to learn more about this podcast, supporting us, or getting involved, you can check the show notes, the podcast description, as well as our website, suicidenoted.com. But however you're involved, even listening once in a while, I really appreciate it. Thanks. And that is all for this Monday's episode. Stay strong. Do the best you can. I'll talk to you soon.